The vampire king hid cameras to protect his paralyzed son until he saw what the new Maid did. Augustus Ashworth had conquered kingdoms and outlived death itself. Yet the moment he feared most wasn't war or betrayal. It was the quiet room at the end of the hall, where his son sat waiting, unable to move and unable to speak for himself. For 3 centuries, Augustus ruled from the shadows, bending empires and watching civilizations rise and rot. Power had always obeyed him. Fear had always worked, until the night it didn't. Nathan's legs stopped responding without warning. No poison. No curse. No enemy Augustus could hunt down. Vampire blood, ancient, dominant, undefeated, failed him. The boy who once raced through castle corridors now sat confined to a wheelchair, his world shrinking while his father stood helpless, watching something far worse than paralysis take hold. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that grows when a child realizes the world no longer waits for him. Augustus learned quickly that vulnerability invited cruelty. In 2 years, 17 caregivers passed through the estate, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked care. Some avoided Nathan's eyes. Others spoke over him, as if stillness meant absence. One left him turned toward a wall for so long that Nathan stopped asking to be moved. That was when Augustus stopped trusting people. The cameras came next, hidden behind oil paintings, embedded in antique chandeliers. Silent lenses watching every room, every interaction, every second Nathan was alone. Augustus told himself it was protection. He didn't admit what it really was. Fear. Then one evening, a maid quit without notice. 6 hours passed before Augustus returned from council business. 6 hours where no one spoke to Nathan. No one checked on him. No one turned his chair. Augustus found his son exactly where he'd been left. That night, Augustus called the agency himself. His voice was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that only exists when rage has nowhere left to go. Amanda Martinez arrived the next morning, blonde, unremarkable, carrying a worn duffel instead of polished luggage. She didn't look like someone who belonged in an immortal king's estate. Before we continue, let us know in the comment section what time it is and where you are watching from. And remember to like and subscribe because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you and I don't want you to miss it. Now, let's continue. Augustus barely glanced at her. He'd already turned back to the screens. He had no idea that letting her through those doors was the most dangerous decision he'd made in centuries. Because what Amanda did, captured by those very cameras, would fracture everything Augustus believed about power, protection, and what his son still needed most. Amanda Martinez stood in the grand foyer with the posture of someone unimpressed by marble columns and vaulted ceilings that had witnessed coronations. She didn't gasp at the oil paintings of long-dead nobility. She didn't flinch when Augustus emerged from the shadows of the East Corridor, his pale form cutting through darkness like a blade through silk. Most mortals stammered in his presence. Their pulses quickened. Their eyes darted toward exits they'd never reach. Amanda simply adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and met his gaze. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, extending a hand he didn't take. She withdrew it without embarrassment. "The agency said you needed someone who could start immediately." Augustus studied her with the calculating precision of a predator assessing prey. Mid-30s. Calloused hands. Her clothing was clean but worn, practical rather than presentational. Her heartbeat was steady, unremarkable. She carried no crosses, no charms, no telltale scent of fierce sweat that usually accompanied those who suspected what he was. "The previous caregiver left without notice," Augustus said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Nathan requires consistency, discipline, Someone who understands that my son's condition demands. Does he like music? The question landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Augustus blinked, an involuntary human gesture he'd abandoned decades ago. What? Your son. Amanda tilted her head toward the corridor that led to Nathan's wing. Does he like music? I saw a piano in the East Room. Wondered if he plays, or if he just likes listening. No one had ever interrupted Augustus Ashworth. Emperors had waited for him to finish sentences. Generals had held their breath for his commands. Nathan hasn't spoken in 4 months, Augustus said coldly, trying to reassert control of the conversation. He has no interest in music or anything else. That wasn't what I asked. Amanda's tone remained gentle, but firm. I asked if he likes it. Not speaking and not feeling aren't the same thing, Mr. Ashworth. Something dangerous flickered behind Augustus's eyes. He could end this woman's employment and her life with a single word. Yet she stood there, waiting for an actual answer as though his immortal authority meant nothing compared to understanding a 12-year-old boy. I don't know, Augustus finally admitted, the words tasting like ash. I never ask. Amanda nodded slowly, as if he'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. Then maybe that's where we start. She walked past him toward Nathan's wing without waiting for permission, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against floors that had been walked by kings. Augustus stood alone in his own foyer, feeling distinctly dismissed. And for the first time in 3 centuries, he didn't know what to do about it. Augustus returned to his study as twilight bled across the horizon, the only time of day when his kind felt truly awake. The monitors glowed in the darkness, 16 screens displaying 16 angles of a home that felt more like a mausoleum than a manor. He told himself he was checking the feeds out of routine. Professional diligence. The same surveillance that had caught the caregiver who'd pocketed silver candlesticks and the nurse who'd answered personal calls during Nathan's physical therapy. But his eyes found Nathan's camera first. The boy sat in his wheelchair near the kitchen window, positioned where Amanda had left him an hour earlier.
Nothing unusual about that.
Nathan spent most days staring at nothing, his hands limp in his lap, his expression carved from the same marble as the foyer statues. Except tonight his head was turned. Augustus leaned forward, fingers hovering over the keyboard that could zoom, enhance, replay. Nathan was watching something in the kitchen. Not staring through it the way he usually did, but actually watching with focus Augustus hadn't seen since before the paralysis. Amanda moved through the frame, unpacking groceries with unhurried efficiency. She wasn't performing for an audience, wasn't trying to engage Nathan with forced cheerfulness or therapeutic exercises disguised as play. She simply hummed while organizing produce, a melody Augustus didn't recognize but found strangely familiar in its ordinariness. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled a copper pot from the lower cabinet and set it on the floor with a hollow thunk. Then another. Then a third. She lined them up like soldiers, adding a dented saucepan and what appeared to be an antique kettle Augustus had forgotten he owned. Nathan's fingers twitched. Augustus's breath caught. An unnecessary reflex, breathing, but the shock made his body remember mortal habits. Amanda retrieved 2 wooden spoons from a drawer and knelt beside the makeshift drum set. She tapped one pot experimentally, the metallic tong echoing through the kitchen's vaulted ceiling. Then she hit it again, establishing a rhythm. Simple. Childish. The kind of noise that would have sent previous caregivers scrambling to restore proper decorum. Nathan's right hand lifted from his lap. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, the kind Augustus might have missed if he'd been watching with mortal eyes. But he saw it. Saw the tremor of effort as Nathan's fingers stretched toward the second wooden spoon Amanda had placed on his wheelchair tray. She didn't react. Didn't gasp or praise or draw attention to the miracle of movement. She just kept drumming, her rhythm steady, leaving space in the pattern like an invitation. Nathan's fingers closed around the spoon. Augustus watched, frozen, as his silent, motionless son, lifted the spoon with agonizing slowness and brought it down on the copper pot beside his chair. The sound was weak, off rhythm, beautiful. Amanda smiled but didn't stop playing. She adjusted her pattern to match Nathan's uncertain beat, turning his single note into harmony. For the first time in 4 months, something that might have been joy flickered across Nathan's face. Augustus sat in the darkness of his study, watching through a camera lens, and felt something he'd thought immortality had stolen from him.
Hope.
Augustus couldn't stay away from the monitors. 3 nights later, he found himself logging in earlier than usual, his fingers moving across the keyboard with an urgency that bordered on addiction. He told himself it was due diligence, verification, the responsible oversight of a father who'd been burned by negligence before. But the truth sat heavier in his chest. He wanted to see if it would happen again. The timestamp read 6:47 p.m. Nathan's camera showed the kitchen bathed in warm evening light, the kind of golden hour that made even immortal eyes ache with something close to nostalgia. Amanda was chopping vegetables at the counter, her movements efficient and unself-conscious. Nathan sat in his usual position near the window, but tonight his wheelchair was angled differently, turned toward the kitchen rather than the garden. Augustus switched to camera 3 for a better view of Nathan's face. The boy's expression was neutral, but his eyes tracked Amanda's movements with an alertness that hadn't existed a week ago. Amanda set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. Without preamble, she crossed to the lower cabinet and began pulling out the copper pots again. 1, 2, 3, 4. She arranged them in a semicircle on the floor, adding a large mixing bowl and what looked like an old pie tin. Then she did something new. She rolled Nathan's wheelchair directly into the semicircle, positioning him at the center of the makeshift instruments. From her apron pocket, she produced the wooden spoons and placed one directly in Nathan's right hand, curling his fingers around it with gentle pressure. "No pressure today," she said quietly, her voice barely audible through the monitor's speaker. "We're just seeing what sounds we can find." She settled cross-legged on the floor beside him, her own spoon poised above the largest pot.
She tapped it once, twice,
3 times. A simple pattern, basic as a heartbeat. Then she stopped and waited. Augustus leaned closer to the screen, his ancient eyes fixed on his son's trembling hand. 10 seconds passed.
20.
Amanda didn't fill the silence with encouragement or instruction. She simply sat, patient as stone, her spoon resting against her knee. Nathan's hand moved. It was less controlled than last time, the spoon wavering in his grip like a compass seeking north. But when it finally struck the copper pot in front of him, the sound rang clear and true. Amanda tapped her pot twice in response, creating a call-and-answer pattern. Nathan hit his pot again, stronger this time. Amanda added a third strike, building complexity. Nathan's face transformed. The blank mask he'd worn for months cracked, and beneath it Augustus saw concentration, fierce, determined, alive. His son was listening, thinking, choosing when and where to strike. The rhythm they created was chaotic, unmusical, completely imperfect. It was the most beautiful thing Augustus had heard in 200 years. Amanda began to hum along with their percussion, a wordless melody that wove through the metallic strikes. Nathan's breathing changed, synchronizing with the beat. His left hand, which hadn't moved voluntarily in over a year, began to tap against his wheelchair arm. Augustus realized he was gripping the edge of his desk hard enough to crack the wood. On screen, Amanda caught Nathan's eye and grinned, not the professional smile of a caregiver celebrating a patient's progress, but the genuine delight of someone sharing a moment of pure, unexpected joy. Nathan smiled back. Augustus stopped the playback and reversed it, watching that smile bloom across his son's face again and again, committing every pixel to memory that would never fade. For 3 centuries, he had believed that love meant protection,
Control.
the vigilant eye that caught every danger before it struck. But watching through the camera now, Augustus began to suspect he'd confused love with fear all along. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, unremarkable except for the rain hammering against the manor's ancient windows. Augustus had logged into the feeds out of habit, expecting the usual dinner routine. Instead, Camera 5 showed Amanda and Nathan in the sunroom, a glass-enclosed space overlooking gardens that had gone wild without the groundskeeper Augustus had dismissed months ago. Amanda sat on the window seat, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the storm. Nathan's wheelchair was positioned beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The dinner tray sat forgotten on the side table, Nathan's meal barely touched. For a long moment, neither moved. Just a woman and a boy watching rain reshape the world beyond the glass. Then Amanda spoke, her voice so quiet Augustus had to increase the audio feed. "I had a brother," she said. "Daniel. He'd be about 25 now if he'd lived." Augustus's fingers stilled on the keyboard. This wasn't in any caregiver training manual. He had muscular dystrophy. Diagnosed at 7, gone by 14. Amanda's reflection in the rain-streaked glass showed an expression Augustus recognized, the particular grief of those who'd lost someone they couldn't save. Toward the end, people stopped talking to him. They'd ask me how he was feeling, what he needed, whether he was comfortable. Like he disappeared, even though he was right there. She turned slightly toward Nathan, though she didn't demand eye contact. Danny hated that most, I think. More than the wheelchair, more than losing the ability to feed himself. He hated being treated like furniture in his own life. Her voice carried no self-pity, just matter-of-fact pain. So I made him a deal. I'd tell him everything, my drama, my problems, my stupid crush on the boy who worked at the library. And he'd blink once for, "That's idiotic," or twice for, "Tell me more." Nathan's eyes shifted toward her face. "He blinked twice a lot," Amanda continued, a small smile crossing her features. "Turns out dying doesn't make you wise, just a really good listener who can interrupt." She pulled her knees up to her chest, looking suddenly younger than her years. "I miss having someone who knew all my mess and didn't try to fix it, who just listened." She glanced at Nathan fully now. "That's why I talk to you like this. Not because I think you're broken and need fixing, but because I think maybe you're tired of people treating your silence like absence." The rain intensified, drumming against glass like 1,000 urgent fingers. "I'm terrified I'm failing here," Amanda admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your father, Mr. Ashworth, he watches me like I'm one mistake away from being fired. And maybe I am. I don't have fancy credentials or years of experience. I just know what it's like to watch someone fade because the world stops seeing them as human." Nathan's left hand, the one that hadn't responded to physical therapy in 18 months, trembled against his armrest. "So I guess what I'm saying is, I see you, Nathan. Not the wheelchair. Not the paralysis. Not the tragedy everyone else sees when they look at you." She reached over and gently touched his hand, the gesture careful but not tentative. "I see you. And I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Nathan's fingers turned slowly beneath hers, palm up, and closed around her hand with strength Augustus didn't know his son still possessed. In his study, Augustus watched through the camera as Amanda's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. And for the first time since installing the surveillance system, he felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred he had no right to see. The power died at 2:47 a.m., plunging 3 centuries of collected history into absolute darkness. Augustus was in the East Wing reviewing trade contracts when every light extinguished simultaneously. For a vampire, darkness was comfort, familiarity, home. But the sudden silence of electrical hum, the ambient noise he'd grown accustomed to in this modern age, sent a bolt of primitive alarm through his chest. The cameras. He moved through the manor with inhuman speed, his form blurring past portraits and tapestries until he reached his study. The monitors were black, lifeless. The backup generators should have engaged within seconds. They hadn't. Augustus's hands moved across the dead equipment, checking connections his rational mind knew were pointless to check. The feeds were down. Nathan was alone in the dark, and Augustus was blind. He was halfway to Nathan's wing when he heard it.
Singing.
The voice was untrained, slightly off-key, drifting from beneath Nathan's door like smoke. Augustus stopped, his hand frozen on the doorframe, and for the first time in decades felt uncertain whether he had the right to enter his own son's room. He eased the door open soundlessly. A single candle burned on the nightstand, casting wavering shadows across walls covered in astronomy posters Nathan had loved before the paralysis. Amanda sat on the edge of Nathan's bed, still in her sleep clothes, worn flannel pants, and an oversized shirt. Nathan was curled on his side, his body trembling with the aftershocks of what must have been a violent awakening. Amanda's hand moved in slow circles across his back while she sang. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." It was a lullaby older than Augustus himself, passed down through generations of mothers who had nothing to offer their children but comfort and voice. Amanda sang it without irony or self-consciousness, her tone gentle and repetitive. Nathan's breathing began to slow, synchronizing with her rhythm. "And if that mockingbird don't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring." Augustus recognized the signs of Nathan's night terrors, the rigid muscles, the rapid shallow breathing, the wide-eyed panic that came from waking into a body that wouldn't obey. They'd plagued his son since the paralysis began, episodes that no medication or therapy had managed to prevent. The medical team's protocol was clinical: controlled breathing exercises, reassurance that he was safe, possibly a mild sedative if the episode persisted. Amanda was simply singing. "And if that diamond ring turns brass, Mama's gonna buy you a looking glass." She didn't tell Nathan he was safe, didn't promise the fear would pass, or explain that his body's panic response was temporary. She just offered her presence and her voice, asking nothing in return. Nathan's hand crept across the blanket toward her. Amanda caught it without breaking rhythm, weaving her fingers through his and continuing the lullaby as though this was the most natural thing in the world, sitting in candlelight with a 12-year-old vampire prince, singing away nightmares that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with the prison of his own flesh. "And if that looking glass gets broke, Mama's gonna buy you a billy goat." The trembling stopped. Nathan's eyes, which had been fixed on some invisible horror only he could see, gradually focused on Amanda's face. His grip on her hand tightened, then relaxed. She sang the lullaby through twice more before his breathing deepened into something approaching sleep. Only then did she notice Augustus standing in the doorway. Their eyes met across the candlelit room. Augustus expected shock, apology, perhaps fear at being caught in the young master's bedroom in the middle of the night. Instead, Amanda's expression held only quiet exhaustion and a question: "Are you here to help, or just to watch?" Augustus had no answer. She returned her attention to Nathan, her thumb tracing gentle circles across his knuckles, and resumed humming the melody until his sleep was certain. The power flickered back on at 3:14 a.m., flooding the room with electric light that felt harsh and intrusive after the candle's warmth. Augustus stepped back into the hallway and closed the door with a silence only his kind could manage. When he returned to his study, the monitors glowed with their familiar blue light, 16 screens capturing 16 angles of his carefully controlled domain. He didn't turn them on. Augustus avoided his study for 3 days. It was a cowardice unbecoming of someone who had negotiated with emperors and stared down rebellions, yet he found himself inventing reasons to stay away. Correspondence that could wait. Estate matters that didn't require his immediate attention. Ancient texts he'd read a dozen times before. Anything to avoid the monitors and what they would show him. On the 4th day, duty dragged him back. Council business required his signature on documents stored in the study's vault. He entered with his eyes fixed deliberately away from the screens, retrieved what he needed, and was almost to the door when he heard it. Laughter. His son's laughter, tinny and distant through monitor speakers, but unmistakably real. Augustus's hand froze on the door handle. He stood there, suspended between escape and surrender, before his body made the choice his mind refused. He turned toward the screens. Camera foreshowed the kitchen bathed in afternoon light. Amanda had spread a canvas drop cloth across the floor, and on it sat a collection of objects that appeared to have been rescued from various corners of the manor. Wooden spoons, yes, but also metal mixing bowls, glass jars filled with rice, bells from the Christmas decorations stored in the attic. Nathan sat in the center of it all, his wheelchair pushed aside, propped on cushions on the floor itself. His right hand clutched a wooden spoon while his left, that left hand that specialists said might never regain voluntary control, gripped a small bell. He was shaking it with fierce concentration while Amanda beat out a rhythm on an overturned stockpot, and the sound coming from his throat wasn't quite words, but wasn't silence either. It was joy, raw and unfiltered. Augustus sank into his chair, the documents forgotten in his lap. He watched Amanda lean over to reposition one of the jars closer to Nathan's reach, watched her demonstrate a pattern, then wait patiently while Nathan attempted to replicate it with shaking hands. Watched her celebrate his successes and ignore his failures, maintaining a steady stream of encouragement that somehow never felt condescending. This was what he'd missed while watching through cameras. He'd seen the copper pots and the wooden spoons. He'd cataloged the progression of Nathan's motor control and documented Amanda's unorthodox methods. He'd watched every session with the clinical detachment of a researcher observing subjects through laboratory glass. But he hadn't been there. Hadn't felt the vibration of sound through the floorboards or smelled whatever Amanda was baking that made the kitchen smell like vanilla and cinnamon. Hadn't experienced the warmth of the afternoon sun that made Nathan's hair glow almost white or felt the specific quality of air in a room filled with unself-conscious happiness. The cameras showed him everything and revealed nothing. They were the glass wall he'd built between himself and the life happening in his own home. He'd told himself they were protection, vigilance, the tools of a father who refused to fail his son again. But watching Amanda help Nathan experiment with a tambourine fashioned from jar lids and string, Augustus recognized the cameras for what they truly were. A coward's distance. A way to care without risking connection. To love without the vulnerability of presence. To parent from behind bulletproof glass where Nathan's pain couldn't reach him and his own helplessness remained abstract. He'd spent 2 years watching his son fade, documenting every loss, recording every small tragedy. And he'd missed the moment Nathan started coming back to life. The decision crystallized with the clarity of dawn breaking over a centuries-long night. Augustus descended from his study at 4:17 p.m. the following day, timing his arrival for what the monitors had taught him was their usual afternoon session. His footsteps echoed through corridors he usually drifted through in silence, each deliberate sound announcing his presence in a way he hadn't allowed himself in months. He paused at the kitchen's arched doorway. The copper pots were arranged in their familiar semicircle. Amanda knelt on the floor, demonstrating something with her hands while Nathan watched with an intensity that made Augustus's chest constrict. The afternoon light caught the dust motes floating between them, turning the ordinary kitchen into something that belonged in a cathedral. Augustus cleared his throat. Amanda's head snapped up. Nathan's did too, his expression shifting instantly from concentration to the guarded blankness he wore like armor around his father. Mr. Ashworth. Amanda rose smoothly, brushing off her knees. No guilt colored her features, no defensive justification for the chaos of instruments scattered across his kitchen floor. I know what you were doing. The words came out harder than Augustus intended. 3 centuries of command roughened his tone, even when he didn't mean them to. I've been watching. Something flickered in Amanda's eyes. The care reports. Of course. I should have been more detailed in my documentation. Not the reports. Augustus stepped fully into the kitchen, and the late afternoon sun felt alien against his skin after so many months of shadow. The cameras. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Amanda's expression didn't change immediately. She processed the information with the same measured calm she brought to everything, her eyes moving almost imperceptibly to the corners of the room, the light fixtures, the decorative molding where lenses could hide. How long? She asked finally. Since before you arrived. Augustus forced himself to meet her gaze. I have cameras throughout the manor. Every room Nathan uses. I've watched every session, every meal, He stopped, the confession tasting like failure. Everything. Nathan made a sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Augustus couldn't look at his son's face, couldn't bear to see the betrayal there. I see. Amanda's voice carried no inflection. She bent to gather the copper pots, her movements deliberate. Then you know I've been neglecting the prescribed physical therapy schedule, using unapproved methods, allowing Nathan on the floor without proper support equipment. Yes. And you've watched us anyway. For how long? Weeks. 3 weeks. 2 days. Amanda stacked the pots with precise, controlled motions. So, every conversation I've had with Nathan, every story I've told him, every stupid song and improvised music session. She looked up, and Augustus saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. Every moment I thought we had privacy, you were there. I needed to ensure that I wouldn't hurt him. Amanda's voice cut like a blade. Because everyone else did. Because you can't trust anyone with your son's safety. She stood, holding the stack of pots against her chest like a shield. I understand that instinct, Mr. Ashworth. I do. But understanding it doesn't make it right. You never meant for us to know we were being watched. That's different from never meaning to do it at all. She moved toward the cabinet, her body language controlled but radiating suppressed emotion. Does Nathan know? Augustus finally looked at his son. Nathan stared at him with eyes that held something worse than anger. Disappointment. The specific devastation of a child realizing his parent is not the hero he needed them to be. He does now, Augustus said quietly. Amanda set the pots down with a metallic clatter that made them all flinch. I need to think about whether I can continue working under surveillance. Nathan deserves better than performing therapy for an invisible audience. Wait. No, Mr. Ashworth. You've been watching for weeks. Now, it's your turn to wait. She untied her apron with sharp movements. I'll stay tonight because Nathan needs consistency. Tomorrow we'll discuss whether I'm staying at all. She walked past Augustus without another word, her shoulder nearly brushing his as she left the kitchen. Nathan and Augustus sat in the wreckage of trust, separated by copper pots and 3 feet of kitchen floor that might as well have been an ocean. Augustus had broken many things in his long life: kingdoms, armies, men who stood in his way. But he'd never felt the specific agony of watching something precious shatter because his own hands had dropped it. Amanda returned at dawn, her footsteps crunching across gravel still damp with night dew. Augustus sat in the garden where he'd spent the entire night, motionless among the overgrown roses, watching the sky cycle through shades of darkness he'd memorized over centuries. He heard her approach but didn't turn, half expecting her departure speech, the professional resignation that would strip Nathan of the one person who'd reached him. She sat on the stone bench beside him without preamble, her presence deliberate but not intrusive. For a long moment, neither spoke. The garden held the particular silence of early morning when the nocturnal world hadn't quite surrendered to day. "I'm not quitting," she said finally. Augustus's shoulders dropped fractionally, a release of tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You have every right to." "I know." Amanda pulled her cardigan tighter against the morning chill. "Spent all night convincing myself I should. Practice the speech and everything." She paused. "But then I remembered Daniel. How toward the end, my parents installed a baby monitor in his room. How violated he felt, even though he understood why." Augustus said nothing, his ancient eyes fixed on roses that had bloomed and died a dozen times since he'd last tended them. The thing is, he forgave them. Not because the surveillance was okay, but because he knew it came from terror, not control. She looked at Augustus directly. "You're terrified. I get that. But Nathan can't heal in a house built on fear. I don't know how to protect him any other way." "I know. That's why I'm staying." Amanda's voice carried the same steady resolve she brought to everything. "But we're doing this differently. The cameras in Nathan's bedroom and bathroom, those go dark. Permanently. The boy deserves privacy in his own spaces." Augustus nodded slowly. "Agreed. The other cameras stay, but you stop hiding behind them." She met his eyes with unwavering directness. "If you want to know how Nathan's doing, you come ask him. Or me. Like a normal parent." "I'm not a normal parent." "Yeah, I caught that." The faintest smile touched her lips. "But you could try being a present one." The words hung between them as the sun crept higher, burning away the mist that clung to the garden's wild edges. "I don't know if I remember how," Augustus admitted, the confession scraping his throat raw. Amanda stood, brushing off her jeans. "Lucky for you, I'm offering a tutorial. There's a session at 4 o'clock today."
Kitchen.
"Copper pots." She paused. "Nathan would probably like it if you joined us." "He wouldn't want." "You don't know what he wants because you've been watching instead of asking." Her tone wasn't cruel, just factual. "4 o'clock, Mr. Ashworth. I'll save you a spoon." She left him in the garden with a choice that felt more daunting than any battlefield he'd commanded. At 3:58 p.m., Augustus stood outside the kitchen, his hand hovering near the doorframe. Inside, he could hear the familiar sounds of copper and wood, Amanda's voice keeping rhythm, Nathan's hesitant strikes growing stronger. He could return to his study, watch from safety, maintain the distance that had protected him from the full weight of Nathan's pain. Instead, he stepped through the archway. Both heads turned. Amanda smiled and gestured to an empty space in the circle of instruments. A wooden spoon lay waiting on the floor. "We're working on a 3-part rhythm," she said simply. "You take the bass line, every 4th beat on the big pot." Augustus looked at his son. Nathan's expression was cautious, uncertain, but not closed. "Not yet." The vampire king, who had stood at the head of 1,000 banquet tables, lowered himself to the kitchen floor. His joints protested the unfamiliar position. His expensive trousers would be ruined.
He didn't care.
He picked up the wooden spoon. Amanda counted them in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Augustus struck the copper pot. The sound was louder than he'd expected, his supernatural strength requiring immediate adjustment. Nathan's eyes widened, then, miraculously, crinkled at the corners. His son was almost laughing. Augustus hit the pot again, gentler this time, finding the rhythm Amanda had established. Nathan added his part, the higher metallic ring weaving through the bass. Amanda layered in a counterbeat that somehow made their amateur strikes sound almost musical. They played for 17 minutes, creating noise that had no artistic merit and every bit of meaning. When Nathan's arms finally tired and he set down his spoon, Augustus didn't return to his study. He stayed on the floor beside his son, both of them breathing hard from the effort, and felt more like a father than he had in 2 years. 3 weeks later, Augustus found himself in the kitchen at 4 p.m. without needing an invitation. The copper pots had been joined by new additions: a xylophone Amanda had found at an estate sale, a set of hand drums Nathan could grip more easily, and a collection of bells in varying sizes that hung from a wooden frame Augustus had built with his own hands. The construction had taken him 4 attempts, his centuries-old carpentry skills rusty from disuse, but Nathan's expression when he'd wheeled it into the kitchen had made every splinter worthwhile. Today they were attempting something Amanda called a sound story, each instrument representing a different character in a narrative she improvised as they played. "The knight approaches the castle," Amanda narrated, striking a deep tone on the largest pot. She nodded to Augustus. He added a rhythmic pattern on the hand drum, the galloping of horses he remembered from battlefields that predated gunpowder. "But the dragon is already awake," Amanda continued, grinning at Nathan. Nathan reached for the xylophone, his left hand still uncertain but growing stronger. He dragged the mallet across the keys in a discordant screech that made all 3 of them laugh. "Perfect," Amanda declared. "Most terrifying dragon I've ever heard." The sessions had evolved beyond therapy into something that defied categorization. Sometimes they played music. Sometimes Augustus read aloud while Nathan listened, and Amanda prepared dinner. Sometimes they simply sat together in comfortable silence, 3 people occupying the same space, without performance or pretense. The cameras still existed. Augustus hadn't removed them, and Amanda hadn't asked him to beyond the bedroom and bathroom. But the monitors in his study gathered dust. He'd watched the feeds exactly twice in 3 weeks, once to verify the new motion sensors were functioning, and once because he'd been detained in a council meeting and wanted to send word he'd be late. Both times, seeing his family through a screen had felt wrong, like reading a letter meant for someone else. Now, when he wanted to know how Nathan's day had been, he asked. Sometimes Nathan responded with gestures or sounds that were gradually becoming more purposeful. Sometimes Amanda translated. Sometimes the answer was simply the expression on his son's face: frustration, joy, exhaustion, hope. Augustus was learning to read them all. The dragon and the knight realized they're both lonely. Amanda continued the story, her tone shifting to something gentler. And maybe they don't have to fight after all. She transitioned into a softer melody. Augustus adjusted his rhythm to match, and Nathan added delicate bell chimes that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon light. The story resolved not with conquest, but with harmony, 3 distinct sounds weaving into something unexpectedly beautiful. When the final notes faded, Nathan looked at Augustus, really looked at him, not through him or past him, and smiled. It wasn't the hesitant, cautious expression of early sessions. It was genuine warmth, the smile of a child who'd rediscovered his father and found him worth keeping. Augustus smiled back, and for the first time in 2 years, it didn't feel like a mask. That night, he passed his study without entering. The monitors could wait. The surveillance feeds could remain unwatched. His son was in the library with Amanda, listening to another chapter of whatever adventure they'd started. Augustus could hear Nathan's almost laugh drifting through the corridors, a sound more precious than any intelligence his cameras could gather. He followed that sound instead, stepping into the warm lamplight where Amanda sat reading and Nathan sat listening, and settled into the chair beside them. Amanda glanced up, marked her page, and without comment shifted the book's angle so Augustus could see the illustrations too. She resumed reading mid-sentence, and Nathan's hand crept across the armrest to rest near his father's. Augustus didn't pull away. The cameras in the library captured the scene: a maid, a paralyzed boy, and a vampire king huddled around a children's book like it contained the secrets of the universe. But Augustus wasn't watching the feed. He was finally, after 2 years of hiding behind glass and distance and the illusion of control, present for the life unfolding in his own home. The kingdom he'd spent centuries building had been conquered by copper pots and wooden spoons, by a woman who treated his son like a person rather than a tragedy, and by the revolutionary idea that love required presence, not surveillance. Augustus Ashworth, who had bent empires and outlasted dynasties, had been brought to his knees by the simple act of sitting on a kitchen floor. And he had never felt more powerful. If this story reminded you that true connection requires presence, not distance, and that love means showing up even when we're afraid, tap the like button, subscribe so you never miss stories like this, share it with someone, and in the comments, tell me, what moment hit you the hardest? Thanks for watching.